Let me start with a situation that happens all the time in pharma. A company has a promising drug. The science looks good. The development team is moving quickly. And then they reach a point where they need a CDMO. So the conversation becomes who can manufacture it? Who has capacity? Who can give us the best price? And that sounds like a supply chain decision. But here is the problem. Your CDMO relationship can actually affect the long-term value of the drug itself. Because once you outsource manufacturing, you are not just transferring production, you may also be transferring process knowledge, technology, analytical development, analytical methods, and sometimes very valuable intellectual property. So in this presentation, I want to look at CDMO selection from a different perspective. Not just manufacturing efficiency, but IP protection, asset value, and strategic optionality. Traditionally, we think about CDMO selection almost like procurement. How much does it cost? What is the timeline? What is the capacity? But look at the other side of the equation. The CDMO decision can influence IP ownership, freedom to operate, merger and acquisition optionality, and ultimately drug asset net present value. That changed the conversation completely. Imagine two CDMOs offering almost identical manufacturing economics. One gives you a slightly better price, the other gives you a stronger ownership provisions, better technology transfer rights, and much more flexibility if you want to move the program later. The second option may actually be dramatically more valuable. So the first principle is simple. Do not evaluate a CDMO only by what it costs to manufacture the product. Evaluate what the relationship does to the value of the asset. And this becomes even more important as the industry consolidates. A modern drug development program can touch multiple external partners across discovery, cell line development, process development, analytical development, clinical manufacturing, commercial manufacturing, and technology transfer. Every additional partner creates another IP touchpoint. And consolidation can make this even more complicated because capabilities, platforms, and technologies may sit under different ownership structures. So instead of thinking about IP as something sitting safely inside a sponsor's organization, think of it as moving through an ecosystem. The more interfaces you create, the more important government systems becomes. And that brings us to the actual IP stack. I like to think about outsourced manufacturing IP in three layers. First, there is the compound or product layer, the molecule and the underlying drug. Second is the process layer, how that molecule is actually manufactured, purified, formulated, or controlled. And third is the platform layer, technologies that may be used across multiple programs. The important point is that these layers don't necessarily belong to the same party. You might own the drug, while the CDMO owns or controls an important manufacturing process or platform technology. And that's where freedom to operate becomes interesting. Because owning the product or drug doesn't automatically mean you control everything required to manufacturing it. Now let's add something that is often underestimated: time. In pharma, time is not just an operational metric. It is an economic variable. You have a patent clock running in the background. Every delay in development, technology transfer, manufacturing, validation, or regulatory execution can reduce the amount of time you have to generate commercial value. So an operational advantage that saves a few weeks may sound small. But when that happens repeatedly across a development program, those weeks can compound. The message here is manufacturing efficiency isn't separate from IP value. When your protected revenue window is finite, operational execution directly affects the economic value of the protection. Now we get to one of the most interesting problems, the traditional fee-for-service model. On paper, it is simple. The sponsor provides the drug program. The CDMO provides manufacturing. The sponsor pays. But what happens when the CDMO develops something new while executing the work? Maybe there is a process development, a process improvement. Maybe there is a new analytical approach. Maybe there is manufacturing innovation. Who owns that innovation? If the contract isn't very carefully structured, you can end up with an uncomfortable asymmetry. The sponsor owns the drug, but the CDMO may retain valuable process assets created around that drug. And that can become a problem later, especially when you want to transfer the program to another manufacturer. This leads to another problem that sounds operational but can become strategic: the change order trap. Imagine a fixed fee manufacturing relationship. Everything works nicely until something changes. A process parameter changes, the analytical method needs modification, the batch doesn't behave exactly as expected. Now you are outside the original scope, so you get a change order. One change order isn't necessarily a problem, but in high uncertainty R&D, you can get several. And suddenly the project that looks predictable becomes slower and more expensive. The bigger issue is the timeline, when every scientific change becomes a commercial negotiation. Scientific uncertainty gets converted into contractual delay, and that's why the engagement model matters. One alternative is the FTE model. Instead of paying for a narrowly defined deliverable, you are essentially buying scientific capacity. That can make a lot of sense during uncertain development. The scientist can investigate, troubleshoot, optimize, and adapt without turning every scientific question into a new commercial negotiation. But there is a trade-off. Flexibility without governance can create a different problem. You need visibility into productivity, ownership, documentation, and technology transfer. So FTE can solve the scientific flexibility problem, but it doesn't automatically solve the IP governance problem. At the other end of the spectrum are the strategic partnerships. And this is where the relationship becomes much more sophisticated. Instead of simply asking who owns the IP, I would break the conversation into 4 areas. What background IP does the sponsor bring? What background IP does the CDMO brings? What new foreground IP is created? And what happens if the relationship ends? That last question is particularly important, because an IP clause isn't truly strategic if it works only while the relationship is healthy. You need an escape mechanism. If the sponsor has to move manufacturing, sell the asset, change suppliers, or enter another geography, the contract has to preserve the ability to do that. So how do you choose between these models? There isn't one universal answer. You have to look at the characteristics of the program. How certain is the budget? How uncertain is the science? How important is the IP ownership? How complex is technology transfer? And how much flexibility will you need later? For a highly predictable program, the traditional fee-for-service structure might work perfectly. But as scientific uncertainty and IP criticality increase, you may need a more flexible and a strategically governed relationship. This is where hybrid models become interesting. You don't necessarily have to force everything into one commercial structure. You can separate the manufacturing relationship from the IP relationship. For example, Manufacturing can remain a service-based relationship, while valuable platform or process technology is handled through a separate licensing structure. That creates a much clearer economic architecture. The CDMO gets compensated for the manufacturing. The sponsor preserves access to a strategically important IP. And both sides can recognize that manufacturing revenue and intellectual property value are not necessarily the same thing. That's a much more sophisticated way of structuring the relationship. Biosimilars give us a very good example of why technical capabilities matter commercially. Here, analytical comparability isn't just a laboratory exercise. It can influence the regulatory and commercial pathway. The CDMO needs to understand the reference biologic, characterize the product appropriately, and demonstrate the right quality attributes. So the value isn't simply manufacturing capacity. It is the combination of manufacturing capability, analytical capability, and regulatory understanding. And this is an important lesson for CDMO selection. Sometimes the most valuable capability isn't visible on the manufacturing floor. It sits in the analytical and scientific infrastructure supporting the program. Cell and gene therapy makes this problem even more obvious. Consider conventional biologics. You generally have a defined starting material, defined processes, and relatively predictable batch structures. Now compare that with autologous cell therapy. The starting material comes from an individual patient. The variability is much higher, and if a batch fails, you are not simply losing manufacturing output. You may be delaying treatment for an actual patient. That changes the economics and the contractual risk. Traditional manufacturing contracts were not designed around this level of variability. CGT requires contracts that reflect the science, not contracts that simply copy the biologics template. And that brings us to a very important CGT principle. In CGT, the process can effectively become part of the product. Manufacturing platforms, viral vectors, process technologies, chain of identity, chain of custody, and specialized know-how can all become critical. And some of that technology may be controlled by the CDMO. So sublicensing becomes extremely important. If you ever need to change manufacturers, expand geographically, or commercialize through another partner, you need to know whether you actually have the rights to do it. For CGT, IP flexibility isn't a nice to have, it is part of manufacturing continuity. Now, let's look forward. The next evolution isn't simply about outsourcing more manufacturing. It is about integrating manufacturing, process analytics, digital systems, and predictive capabilities. That's where the CDMO concept becomes interesting. Imagine a manufacturing environment where process data, analytics, digital twins, and predictive models are integrated into development and manufacturing workflow. The benefit isn't only operational efficiency. It can create a stronger regulatory story, better process understanding, and potentially greater geographic flexibility. So digital integration can become more than an IT investment. It can become a competitive and regulatory advantage. But there is another tool that can change how sponsors evaluate CDMOs. Reverse patent intelligence. Instead of simply asking a CDMO, what technology do you have? You can look at the innovation footprint. What patents have they filed? What technical areas are they investing in? What platforms appear repeatedly? What technologies seem to be central to their strategy? That information can help validate the technical claims made during partner selection. In other words, don't just listen to the sales presentation. Look at the innovation record. The patent landscape can tell you a very different story about what a potential partner actually considers strategically important. So if you're going to take all of this seriously, what should actually go into the agreement. At a minimum, I would think carefully about 7 areas. First, IP assignment and carve outs. Second, sublicensing rights. Third, change control. Fourth, technology transfer on termination. Fifth, quality agreements and ownership of relevant documentation. Six, audit rights. And 7, supply continuity. Notice something about this list. Only some of these sound like traditional IP clauses. That's the point. IP protection is not one paragraph in the contract. It is an architecture that connects ownership, operations, technology transfer, quality, and continuity. So when you evaluate a CDMO, don't stop at the traditional scorecard. Look at 4 systematic dimensions. First, ownership precedent. Have they successfully transferred technology and process improvements before? Second, technology transfer independence. Can you actually move the process somewhere else? Third, financial stability. What happens to your IP and supply continuity if the partner's financial situation changes? And fourth, digital maturity. Can they provide the infrastructure needed to manage increasingly complex development programs? These questions help you move from asking, is this CDMO good, to asking the more important question, is this CDMO strategically safe for this asset? So let me bring everything together. The biggest mistake is to think of CDMO selection as a procurement decision. It isn't. The engagement model you choose can influence asset valuation, competitive positioning, manufacturing flexibility, IP ownership, and ultimately your strategic options. A transactional model may give you simplicity and predictable pricing, but it can create change order friction. An FTE or partnership model can provide greater scientific flexibility, but it requires a stronger governance. And newer hybrid or integrated models can potentially turn manufacturing from simply a cost center into a source of regulatory, operational, and IP advantage. So if there is one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it is this. Don't ask only which CDMO can manufacture my drug. Ask which engagement structure protects the value of my drug while giving me the freedom to change, scale, transfer, license, or commercialize it in the future. Because the CDMO contract doesn't just define how your drugs get manufactured. It can help determine what that drug is ultimately worth. And that's why the model is the strategy.